This aircraft will not be able to fly, but no one on board has any idea about that yet. And what's soon about to happen was caused by an absolutely infuriating chain of corporate neglect and unfortunate circumstances, with a backstory reaching decades into the past. On March 10, 1989, at around noon, Air Ontario Flight 1363, with 65 passengers and 4 crew members on board, was scheduled to fly from Dryden, Ontario, over to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Dryden is a small city in northwestern Ontario, Canada, located approximately 300 kilometers or 186 miles east of Winnipeg. Dating back to around 1880, it had initially been used as a way station for the Canadian Pacific Railway, which connected Thunder Bay in the east with Winnipeg in the west. And at the time of this story, it still served as a kind of way station. This time for Air Ontario, which, like the Canadian Pacific Railway, also linked Thunder Bay with Winnipeg. Now, March 10 was a cold winter Friday, with temperatures around the airport nearing freezing. And among the passengers of Flight 1363 were several families who were about to start their vacations, since this was the Friday before the Ontario spring break. The aircraft that was going to be used was a Fokker F-28-1000 Fellowship, with registration Charlie Fox Oscar November Foxtrot. And around Flight 1363's departure time, it was also snowing from low clouds in the area. The aircraft had arrived at Dryden Airport at 11:40 local time, and only about 30 minutes later it taxied out to runway 29 for its departure towards Winnipeg. But it would never get there. Initially, a lot of people in the industry believed that the accident that followed and the events that had led up to it were obvious, and that the investigation would therefore be quick and straightforward. But when the final investigation report was published 3 years later, it turned out to be 1,364 pages long just for the main body of the investigation. A total of 166 witnesses were being called to testify, which generated some incredible 34,000 pages of transcripts. So, what had the investigation turned out that needed that many pages to explain? Well, to begin to answer that, I have to go back about 3.5 years earlier to another accident that happened under very similar conditions. On the 11th of December 1985, Aero Air 1285, a DC-8, crashed after takeoff from Gander International Airport in Newfoundland, Canada, killing all 248 passengers and 8 crew members on board. And its flight path turned out to be eerily similar to that of Air Ontario Flight 1363. In its accident report, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board admitted that it was unable to determine the exact sequence of events which had led to that crash, but they named as the most probable cause ice contamination on the leading edge and the upper surfaces of the wings, which was also supported by the meteorological conditions at the time of the crash. But there turned out to be some dissent among the board members when it came to this conclusion. Only 4 of them, and the chairman, supported the icing scenario, whilst the other 4 were convinced that some type of in-flight explosion had caused the accident, and therefore challenged the assumption that a thin coating of ice could have caused something this dramatic. So when the CASB published its final report in October of 1988, barely 5 months before the accident in this video, a controversy arose in Canada, with the media highlighting this dissent within the board and aviation experts openly criticizing it. Now, that definitely didn't improve the CASB's standing in the public eye, especially since the passengers who had lost their lives were young American soldiers returning from a peacekeeping mission in the Sinai Desert. On top of that, the CASB was also openly criticized for not being independent of Transport Canada, the regulatory authority that oversaw all Canadian aviation. It was, rightfully so, seen as problematic that a regulatory authority, which could become the object of an investigation, would essentially be investigating itself. And the memory of this controversy was still fresh in the memory of the people at the time of this story. This meant that barely 3 weeks after the CASB had started its investigation into this accident, the Canadian Minister of Transport decided to pulled the plug on the investigation, with the government instead appointing a judge to serve as an independent commissioner and head of the investigation, giving him the power of full judicial inquiry. Now, this judge was the Honorable Virgil P. Moshansky, and his findings would go far beyond a single cockpit decision, as you will soon see. He actually discovered the story behind the story, the root cause, and thereby forever changed the global aviation safety community's perception of what happened and how accident investigations should be done. Even today, this accident report is still being quoted, and then just referred to as the Moshansky report. So with that in mind, let's now walk through what had happened on this fateful day and in the days leading up to it. On March 10, 1989, the crew of Flight 1363 started their working day at Winnipeg International Airport at time 0640. According to their schedule, they were supposed to fly to Thunder Bay via Dryden and then back to Winnipeg again via Dryden, followed by a Winnipeg-Thunder Bay return flight without the Dryden stop. And the crew that were going to share this day were Captain George Morwood, First Officer Keith Mills, and flight attendants Catherine Say and Sonja Hartwick. Captain Morwood was a 52-year-old experienced pilot who had obtained his commercial pilot license before he had even turned 20. He had then accumulated over 24,000 hours of total experience over his 36 years in service, and about half of that time had been spent flying single-engine aircraft. But back in 1973, he had then joined Great Lakes Airlines, a forerunner to Air Ontario, and had then flown over 9,000 hours on the Convair 580, which is a beautiful twin-engine turboprop that typically carried around 50 passengers. Now, he was soon appointed as the company check pilot on the Convair, and from 1978 to 1980 he had even served as the chief pilot on it. Now, he was seen as a very thorough pilot who displayed a great commitment to safety and comfort of his crew and passengers. On this day, he was joined by First Officer Keith Mills, who was 35 years old at the time of this flight, and he had accumulated a total flying time of about 10,000 hours on several different aircraft types like the Cessna 402, the de Havilland Twin Otter, and the Hawker Siddeley 748. On top of that, he had also flown about 3,500 hours on the Cessna Citation, which is a light executive jet, but he hadn't flown any larger jet than that. Now, looking at both of these pilots' flying careers, there are some points of interest that are worth pointing out. For one thing, whilst they were quite experienced, both of them had minimal experience flying the Fokker 28, just about 150 hours between them. And neither of them had significant experience in flying large jets. Captain Morwood had only 591 hours on the Gulfstream II, plus about 82 hours on the Fokker 28, and First Officer Mills had those 3,500 hours in the Citation, but that's a small, straight-wing business jet and not really comparable to the much more complex swept-wing Fokker 28, on which he had only 66 hours. Now, today you probably wouldn't find two pilots with that little combined experience flying together in a jet airliner, and in fact, one of the recommendations of the Moshansky report would be to establish rules for crew scheduling that would prevent exactly this from happening. But in any case, this would have meant that it's likely that neither pilot in the cockpit of Flight 1363 felt very comfortable with their level of proficiency. And that was especially true since they had received an appallingly small amount of conversion training onto the Fokker 28. Now, that was not the end of this crew's shortcomings, which I'll get back to in a second, but before I do, I have some exciting news. First, I want to thank NordVPN for once again sponsoring this video and making these kind of productions possible. But the news is that as of May of 2026, Nord has launched their next generation antivirus, making them much more of an all-in-one digital security app than just a tool that lets you watch your favorite shows from anywhere. As you probably know, traditional antivirus software is reactive. They wait until something malicious lands on your device before cleaning it up. But NordVPN's new feature is way more proactive. It identifies fake shops, blocks phishing sites using AI, and scans files for malware before you even have a chance to click and download them. And by doing that, they can intercept the harm before it even comes into contact with your device. Now, all of the usual encryption and features of the old NordVPN are still there, including ad blocking, dark web monitoring, and scanning for vulnerable information exposed from data leaks. But now, with their new preventive next-generation antivirus, Nord is evolving into a truly comprehensive digital security solution. So if you want to try this out and get 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year deal, then click on this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/pilot. And remember, Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you lose nothing by trying them out. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to those 2 pilots and their low jet experience. Captain Morwood had received 20 hours of Fokker 28 simulator training in February of 1988, which was over a year earlier. And just for reference, today the minimum amount of simulator training is double that, 40 hours. After his initial training, he had then been unable to start his line training due to delays in the Fokker 28 program. So instead, he had gone back to flying the Convair 580 until in January of 1989. Now, to again prepare for the changeover to the Fokker 28 after almost a year of his initial training, he completed just 8 hours of recurrent sim training, followed by 27.5 hours of line training. And then we come to First Officer Mills, and incredibly, he hadn't received any simulator training at all on the Fokker 28 because the simulator had not been available since it was fully booked. So instead, after completing ground school in January of 1989, he had received his flight training in the real aircraft during 4 late-night flights from Winnipeg Airport when the aircraft wasn't needed for any revenue service. This meant that his total training time amounted to 8.3 hours plus a 1.2-hour proficiency check ride. And as a type rating instructor and examiner myself, I very much doubt that training included much of the mandatory steps that a type rating absolutely requires today. So, if this training history seems a little bit strange to you, it is. But it was also almost a perfect example of how things were done at Air Ontario at the time and how this airline had evolved. You see, the first officer's instructor on these night training flights was Captain Joseph Deleuze, the son of Stanley Matthew Deleuze, which was a key figure in the history of Canadian aviation. Born in 1923, Deleuze Sr. had flown Hawker Hurricanes for the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II, and he had then, in 1951, purchased a Stinson aircraft, and with that launched a company that would eventually become a family-owned aviation empire. What began as a bush charter operator, serving remote northern communities, then underwent numerous mergers and acquisitions over the course of more than 30 years, ultimately transforming into the scheduled airline Air Ontario. Formed in June of 1987, it was the result of the merger of 2 Ontario regional airlines, Austin Airways Limited and Air Ontario Limited, each with its own heritage, culture and operational environment. Eventually, Air Canada purchased 75% of this new company because, considering the deregulation of the airline industry, it was looking for a cost-effective feeder airline to serve its trunk routes. But the Deleuze family held the remaining 25% and retained full financial and operational control, with Stanley Deleuze as the chairman and his eldest son, William Deleuze, as the vice chairman and CEO. But forging a single corporate identity out of the 2 companies which had merged into Air Ontario would prove to be a difficult task. Austin Airways was a bush and regional carrier, flying to gravel airstrips or using frozen lakes in harsh and unforgiving operating environments up north. And its 600 employees were a non-unionized, flexible, informal workforce where pilots would happily help load cargo or fuel the aircraft if necessary, basically a classic bush flying culture. Great Lakes Airlines, on the other hand, the precursor of Air Ontario, actually had one of the earliest so-called feeder trunk relationships with Air Canada, operating the Convair 580 turboprops and feeding passengers from regional Southern Ontario centres into Air Canada's mainline network at Toronto. So Air Ontario Limited was, when it was founded, in almost every respect the opposite of Austin Airways. It was a clean, focused southern commuter operation flying a single aircraft type, the Convair 580, into major urban airports with paved runways, controlled airspace and modern navigation aids. and its approximately 250 employees were largely members of their dedicated unions. And those different company cultures had put Air Ontario under immense strain. So when its management eventually tried to negotiate a collective agreement for all of its pilots, they failed miserably. That then led to a strike lasting from March to May of 1988, and it ultimately resulted in the sale of the northern bush flying operation and the layoff of around a third of the workforce. On top of that, the original fleet of 9 different aircraft types, which had caused a real operational training and maintenance nightmare, had to be scaled down. Now, those challenges alone were big enough for Air Ontario's management, but in the summer of 1987, before that strike had started, the company had also decided to offer jet services for the very first time. And that had resulted in the acquisition of 2 used Fokker 28-1000 aircraft, formerly operated by Turkish Airlines. Now, the Fokker 28 is a twin-engine short-range aircraft with tail-mounted engines that can carry up to 65 passengers. And it was actually the aircraft that I did my multi-crew corporation course on back in the day. In any case, the F-28 program was scheduled to begin in late April of 1988, but was then delayed until June the 1st due to that pilot strike that I mentioned. Now, introducing a new aircraft type into an airline requires a lot more than just buying the aircraft and begin operations. It is a complex, time-consuming process that includes establishing the necessary infrastructure like maintenance facilities and spare parts, and it also requires training the pilots and cabin crew, as well as the ground staff, not to mention the compilation of thousands of pages of documentation necessary for its safe and legal operation. Now, Air Ontario had no experience in operating a complex jet of that size and performance, so the required learning curve had to be very steep. And when that additional stress was placed on the organization, it soon began to unravel. And that finally brings us back to that haphazard training of First Officer Mills and his instructor, Joseph Deleuze, the brother of Air Ontario's then current CEO, William Deleuze. Not only was he a Fokker 28 check and training pilot, he was also the Fokker 28 chief pilot and program manager, and on top of that, the Convair 580 chief pilot. So to put it mildly, Captain Joseph Deleuze was overwhelmed by his multiple duties, and the tasks under his responsibility were therefore not handled with the care that they really required. For example, the Fokker 28 fleet were operated using 2 different operating manuals that had been used by some other airlines, both of which were outdated. But even worse, another deficiency that would eventually contribute specifically to this story was the minimum equipment list, or the MEL for the Fokker 28, which had not been fully developed and approved by Transport Canada before the fleet started flying. And the fact that Air Ontario was still granted an operator's certification under these circumstances was essentially due to a lack of supervision by Transport Canada. You see, the minimum equipment list, or MEL, is one of the most important documents for operating commercial aircraft safely. It specifies which pieces of equipment may be inoperative while still allowing the aircraft to be legally dispatched, and the Moshansky investigation would later reveal that the aircraft involved in this story had been operated without an approved MEL from June to December of 1988. So with the lack of proper guidance, Air Ontario's Fokker 28 pilots had developed the practice of recording technical defects on yellow post-it notes for the next crew, instead of actually writing them up in the aircraft tech log, which they had to. Now, this was a practice that was obviously illegal and resembled the safety culture of a bush flying service more than that of a scheduled airline. During the investigation, one captain testified about the post-it practice. As pilots, we wanted this operation to be successful, and I think that's what influenced our thinking in a lot of ways and why we tolerated a lot of this stuff for as long as we did. And as it turns out, the airline didn't just look the other way when pilots did these legal things. They actually expected them to do it. On one occasion, 2 pilots found themselves on an aircraft with so many technical problems that they decided that they had had enough. So instead of just writing a post-it, they wrote down the issues in the legally required tech log, which effectively grounded the aircraft. And for having done this, they were soon summoned before the chief pilot, Joseph Deleuze, who threatened to suspend them for obstructing Air Ontario's operations. Now that absolutely horrifies me, because it's so far away from the just culture that all airlines are supposed to practice today. In any organization, the safety culture always starts at the top, and without a supportive safety environment where people are encouraged to speak up when they see something wrong, bad things will eventually happen. Anyway, one of the pieces of equipment that the MEL deals with is the Auxiliary Power Unit, or APU. This is a small jet engine that is mounted in the tail of the aircraft, and it provides electrical power and air conditioning primarily on the ground when the engines are switched off. And it can also provide compressed air to start the main engines, but since ground equipment can normally perform all of these functions, it is often permissible to operate an aircraft without a working APU. But the conditions under which that is permitted are precisely and specifically defined in the MEL, which normally leaves no room for interpretation. And on the morning of March the 10th, when Captain Morwood accepted his aircraft in Winnipeg, it already had a history of problems with its APU, going back at least 5 days. On March the 5th, a captain had noted that the APU was not producing enough air pressure to start the main engines, and that oily fumes from it had filled the cabin shortly after takeoff. Now that issue, the oily fumes, had also been reported twice before, on January 21st and February 27th, so when it happened again on March the 5th, maintenance suspected that it was due to residual oil in the air conditioning ductwork. But they didn't take any action to try and fix it. Then, on March the 6th, Captain Morwood had operated this same aircraft, and again oily fumes had filled the cabin, this time leading to complaints from the passengers and even triggering a smoke detector. So he then wrote it up in the tech log, and in response to that, maintenance finally did remove some oil from the APU outlet ducting. At this point, there had been 4 incidents involving smoke or fumes in the cabin, which should all have been reported to the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, but they were not. It would also likely have been prudent to ground this aircraft for extensive troubleshooting of this issue, but instead, it was just kept flying. Then, on March the 8th, on a flight from Winnipeg over to Dryden, again oily smoke or fumes filled the cabin and a smoke detector was triggered. And the captain on that flight was Robert Nyman, a regular line pilot, but someone who had previously been director of flight operations and was viewed as one of the most senior and most respected pilots in the company. But despite that, he didn't write up the smoke incident in the tech log because, as he put it, it was a reoccurring intermittent problem that maintenance knew about. So instead, he just deactivated the smoke detector by pulling its circuit breaker, which was then inadvertently not reset until 2 flights later. Maybe you guys are starting to see the holes in Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model lining up. Well, the Mushansky report had some clear words on all of that. This mishandling of the cabin smoke incident reflects shoddy, lax flight operation practices, and coming from a pilot of Captain Nyman's stature, it most certainly would have sent the wrong signal to his first officer, the flight attendants, and anyone else in the organization who learned of it. In any case, the APU kept producing various problems, and on the morning of March 9, after which the APU had appeared to be working properly, its fire detection system was then found to be defective. There was now no time for further troubleshooting, so the APU was finally declared inoperative. Now this time the defect was handled according to the minimum equipment list, with an MEL reference being assigned, which specified the defect and the conditions under which the aircraft would be allowed to operate. But Air Ontario's maintenance staff were not familiar with the F-28's MEL and therefore dispatched the aircraft under the wrong MEL reference. You see, there were actually 2 reference numbers under which an inoperative APU could be deferred. Number 49-1 referred to an inoperative APU, and number 49-04 referred to the fire extinguishing system on the APU being defective. Now, number 49-01 should have been used here, but instead 49-04 was entered into the logbook, even though this was the fire detection system that was inoperative, not the fire extinguishing system. And for Flight 1363, this would turn out to make a big difference, since under 49-01, it was explicitly stated that dispatch was not permitted without the APU if it was required for ground or flight operations, like providing electrical power or starting the engine. So if anyone involved in the decision to dispatch this aircraft on that day had been aware of those rules, Dryden would not have been accepted as a destination, and this video would likely never have been made. And I'll soon explain why. On the morning of March the 10th, 1989, Captain Morwood and his crew arrived at work to find that they were expected to fly 6 route sectors with an inoperative APU. These flights were to be operated under the code-share agreement with Air Canada, meaning that Air Canada also had a stake in this whole operation. Now, to understand what ultimately happened here, it's important to also understand the typical mindset of a crew that's facing a short-haul rotation with 6 legs in a single day. You see, even without technical issues, there is no guarantee that you'll get in and out of every airport on time, and if you lose even 10 minutes at every stop, you'll end up being significantly delayed towards the end of the day. So those familiar with this kind of operation will tell you that the speed and quality of ground handling during the turnarounds basically determines whether you finish your workday on time, feeling satisfied and accomplished, or late, feeling exhausted and frustrated. Now, starting a day like this with an unserviceable APU basically guarantees that you won't finish on time. And that's because at every step you'll need ground assistance, an electrical power supply, either coming from a ground cart or from a power line connected to a jetway, and an air starter unit that can generate compressed air for the first engine start. Now, getting hold of these units and having them set up, etc., always takes additional time, as well as extra procedures that are required to be used in order to do it. But on this particular day, there was a much more serious problem at Dryden Airport. They didn't even have an air starter unit. Now, that should have led to the decision to cancel the intermediate stops at Dryden and just fly the Winnipeg Thunder Bay sectors and its return trip non-stop due to that MEL restriction that I mentioned before. And that was a decision that was the responsibility of Air Ontario's operational control, which consisted of supposedly trained dispatchers who had access to weather information and technical dispatch requirements, among other things. But instead of sensibly cancelling those Dryden stops, they instead favoured a workaround for this problem, which again had its roots firmly in bush flying culture. You see, the solution that they had come up with was to keep one of the engines on the ground running during the transit, and then use compressed air from that engine via the crossbleed valve to start the other engine when it was time to go. This seemed to be the perfect solution to ensure that all sectors could be flown as planned, but it would later put Captain Morwood in an almost impossible position and become one of the main contributing factors to this accident. In any case, Flight 1362 departed Winnipeg at time 0749 with a short delay of 13 minutes because Captain Morwood had ordered de-icing, and that is worth remembering. Despite the unsettled Ontario winter weather with low clouds, reduced visibility and the threat of icing, the following flights over to Thunder Bay via Dryden then went reasonably smoothly. And during the stopover in Dryden, one engine was kept running. Now, that might have seemed like an elegant workaround at first, but in reality, it really wasn't. Imagine an aircraft with an engine running while being serviced on the ground. Apart from it being a bit dangerous to ground staff, it is also causing a lot of nuisance, considering the noise, fumes and fuel consumption. On top of that, care had to be taken not to inadvertently shut down the remaining engine, as doing so would have left the aircraft stranded in Dryden, probably overnight until an air starter unit could be brought over from another airport. So knowing this, it's safe to say that most other airlines would have simply skipped the Dryden stop to avoid all of this, especially if the correct MEL reference would have been used. But Flight 1362 then just continued to Thunder Bay, where it arrived at 10:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is 1 hour ahead of Dryden with a 20-minute delay. And in Thunder Bay, the flight number changed over to 1363 for the return trip to Winnipeg via Dryden, and it was at that point that the problems really began. You see, the aircraft was refueled with around 7.2 tons for the return flight, and everything seemed to be in place for a speedy departure. But about 30 minutes after landing, Air Canada's Thunder Bay station notified Air Ontario's Operational Control Office that Flight 1363 was overweight. It turns out that Air Canada had booked 10 additional passengers and their baggage onto Flight 1363 from an earlier cancelled flight. And this would now cause the aircraft to exceed its maximum landing weight in Dryden, since the fuel used for that short flight from Thunder Bay wouldn't sufficiently reduce its weight. Now, since the flight was already delayed and Captain Morwood didn't want to lose any more time, he quickly decided to decline the additional passengers and their baggage and get it offloaded. And that would bring the aircraft's landing weight back down below the limit. But Air Ontario's Operations Control Duty Manager then overruled that decision, deciding that the passengers would remain on board and that the appropriate weight reduction would instead be achieved by offloading fuel. Now, defueling an aircraft is a rarely performed, time-consuming procedure, and it requires a fuel truck to take care of the fuel that is removed from the tanks. So this would definitely prolong their delay. But the pilots had really no choice but to agree, since if they had refused the passengers, that would have been their responsibility, whereas this extended delay would fall on operations control. Having said that though, these pilots were not happy about this. Just when they thought that they could continue their workday with only a slight delay, this must have felt like if someone had just thrown a wrench into their plans. On top of this, there was also considerable confusion surrounding this whole process and the decision-making behind it from the company. Flight attendant Sonja Hartwick would later testify that it felt like they were ignored, as if nobody on the ground cared for them at all. And one of Air Ontario's ground staff recalled that the pilots had been in very good spirits when they arrived in Thunder Bay, but that they had left angry and frustrated. In any case, Flight 1363 finally left Thunder Bay at time 11:55, now about an hour behind schedule. And remember, this crew still had 2/3 of their workday ahead of them at that point. Several passengers on board were now also worried about their connecting flights, and a lot of baggage had been left behind in Thunder Bay, which would obviously cause even more problems once they arrived at Dryden. So this was no longer a particularly happy ship, but it was soon about to get even worse. You see, while all of this was happening, an updated weather forecast for Dryden had been issued, predicting light freezing rain for their arrival time. But the pilots didn't know about that, since their dispatch office had neglected to include this in their briefing package. So they were still relying on a previous report which forecasted only light rain. Now, normally this wouldn't have posed a huge problem, since de-icing equipment was available at Dryden, but in order to actually do that de-icing, both engines would have to be shut down, which of course would mean no way of starting them again for this crew due to their inoperative APU and the absence of an air starter. Now, the reason for not being able to de-ice with the engines running was that a bulletin had been distributed to the airline's Fokker 28 pilots, which explicitly stated, "Never spray the aircraft with de-icing fluid with engines running." And that policy had been put in place by Air Ontario itself, since it was fearing that de-icing fluid could be ingested into the engines, leading to fumes in the cabin. Something that of course carried a bitter irony here, considering that they had been quite relaxed regarding the handling of those oily fumes that had actually been coming from their aircraft's APU earlier. And maybe even more ironically, in the Mushansky report, this policy was deeply questioned, as de-icing with engines running had been practiced in Europe for a long time without any kind of issues. I have actually done that myself many times. But what all of this meant was that a trap had now effectively been set for Captain Morwood and his team. If maintenance had deferred the inoperative APU under the correct reference number, it would have been clear that dispatch to stations requiring it for ground operations was not allowed. And if the dispatchers had realized that there was a chance of freezing rain at Dryden, they would have understood that ground operations there would depend on de-icing, which in turn would require a complete engine shutdown and therefore make the turnaround impossible. In the Mushansky report, the supporting function of a well-working dispatcher system was seen as an integral safety element of Canadian commercial aviation. But unfortunately, Air Ontario's dispatchers proved to be more a liability than a help. During the investigation, it was revealed that they often generated flight release documents with serious numerical errors, and that the company's pilots had become used to just correcting these errors themselves instead of requesting corrections from the dispatchers. Also, the dispatcher who handled the flight release for Flight 1363 was originally a ramp worker with no aviation experience beyond that. And he had received only 1 week of training and 1 week of job observation before starting to work independently with minimal supervision. Judge Moshansky later used this and other sources to show that Air Ontario had provided its dispatchers with inadequate training and that neither dispatcher involved with Flight 1363 was qualified to do their job. Anyway, when Flight 1363 finally touched down at Dryden Airport at time 11:39 Central Standard Time, 44 minutes after departing Thunder Bay, the trap finally snapped shut. By that time, it was snowing at Dryden, and there was now no way to de-ice the aircraft since one engine had to be kept running due to the missing air starter unit. The temperature was +1 degree Celsius, and witnesses later described big, wet snowflakes falling which melted on contact with the ground. Now, as soon as the aircraft stopped at the ramp and the baggage was unloaded, a fuel truck arrived and the so-called hot refueling began. This meant that the aircraft was being refueled with one of their engines still running and some of the passengers still on board, and that procedure required the fire brigade to be present. But unfortunately, they now didn't arrive on time, which still didn't stop the refueling from starting anyway. Now, hot refueling, especially with passengers on board, is a quite questionable practice, to be fair, and that really shouldn't have any place in a scheduled airline operation. If that is done at all, it's typically done in military aviation under tactical conditions or in the northern bush flying environment. And just to increase the complexity and stress even more here, in this case, the flight attendants and pilots had different contradictory procedures for how this type of refueling should be done. In any case, after the aircraft had parked, Captain Morwood was observed walking into the terminal building, and several witnesses later described how he tried unsuccessfully and with increasing frustration to reach a local Dryden number by telephone, while standing inside the Air Ontario ticket counter. It is very likely that he was trying to reach the fire brigade to help them with the refueling, and as he was doing that, he was also apologizing to his inbound passengers for leaving some of their baggage behind at Thunder Bay. He then tried calling Air Ontario's operations control office and had a heated conversation with the duty manager about all of this confusion, which ended with him slamming down the receiver of the phone. But although he seemed quite aggravated, the passengers that he spoke with described him as polite and considerate. And given what a frustrating day he was having, that must have taken a lot of energy in order to maintain a controlled outward appearance. Now, while he was inside the terminal, the refueling had actually been completed, with or without a fire brigade, so he then hurried back out to the aircraft and then just jumped into the cockpit without performing a walk around. Everyone who saw him testified later that he seemed to be very much in a hurry, and that was probably because snow had now started to accumulate on the aircraft. At time 12:01, Flight 1363 then started up its second engine and reported that they were ready for taxi. But by that time, the snowfall had increased substantially, blanketing the eastern half of the airport. The wings of the aircraft were now reported to have been covered with up to 1/4 of an inch of snow, which is about 0.6 centimeters. And while that might not sound very much, in commercial aviation, any snow on the aerodynamic portions of an aircraft's wing or stabilizer or fin is too much snow. Once the after-start checklist had been completed, the aircraft started to move, but instead of receiving a direct clearance to enter and backtrack the runway, Flight 1363 was now ordered to halt at the intersection of taxiway Alpha and runway 29, since the pilot of a small single-engine Cessna 150 had become trapped in the poor visibility. And he was now urgently requesting priority to land, which caused Captain Morwood to express his frustration and disbelief over the radio regarding this additional delay. But there was obviously nothing that he could do. Meanwhile, the snowfall just increased further in intensity and the visibility decreased to around half a mile. The aircraft wings were by this time covered in snow of a depth to up to half an inch, which is about 1.3 centimeters. And The eastern half of the runway was now covered in about the same depth of slush, which would have an impact on both the acceleration of the aircraft and its ability to stop if needed. After the Cessna had finally managed to land, which took about 2.5 extra minutes, Flight 1363 finally entered the runway and taxied eastbound to the threshold of runway 29, where it turned around. And at around time 13:09 and 40 seconds, the thrust levers were pushed forward to initiate its takeoff roll. Now, with at least 1.3 centimeters of wet, layered snow on its wings. At this point, I'm sure many of you are wondering, how could two experienced pilots decide to ignore something as basic as snow covering their wings? Why didn't they simply refuse to depart if they couldn't or wouldn't de-ice the aircraft without an APU or ground power? Well, first of all, Air Ontario's Flight Operations Manual didn't mention snow in the section about wing contamination prohibiting takeoff. It only mentioned frost and freezing precipitation. And more importantly, remember what I said earlier about these pilots' flight experience? Specifically that they were both relatively new at flying jets, but had loads of experience with propeller-driven aircraft? Well, that likely changed this picture completely. You see, in the turboprop world at Air Ontario, snow on the wings didn't necessarily preclude a takeoff. A flight attendant later testified that she had been seeing pilots test the consistency of the snow on the wings with their hands before departure, and they had done that to determine whether or not the snow would blow off during the takeoff. She also recalled at least one takeoff in a Convair 580 which had loads of snow on its wings, and that she had then seen it being blown off during the takeoff. Now, when Flight 1363 had landed in Dryden, the snowfall had consisted of fluffy flakes that melted upon impact with the ground of the aircraft, and Captain Morwood had seen this kind of snow probably hundreds of times during his many years of flying propeller aircraft, much of it in winter conditions. So he likely believed that his experience put him in a position to reliably judge whether the snow would blow off during the takeoff or not. Only this time he was wrong. So why was that then? Well, some of the passengers actually looked at the wings as the aircraft accelerated, and they later testified that at one point large patches of snow did fly off the wing. But then a grey layer of ice with a rough, irregular surface appeared underneath it, and that didn't fly off. Now, this frozen layer was likely caused by a phenomenon called cold-soaked fuel. It occurs when jets cruise at high altitudes where the air is cold enough to cool the fuel in the wing tanks down to temperatures well below freezing. Now, jet wings have much sleeker profiles than turboprops do, offering less space for the fuel, and because of that, nearly the entire wing surface area is in contact with fuel, even if the tanks are not full. So if that fuel is very cold, it will then cool the aluminium skin of the wing down to nearly the same temperature, and that can cause clear ice to form on the wings from moist air when the aircraft is parked on the ground, even on warm days, and of course from wet precipitation. So when this aircraft had landed in Dryden, the estimated fuel temperature was minus 6.4 centigrades. And although more fuel had then been uplifted, the new fuel was not warm enough to raise the temperature of the wing surface by very much. So when the aircraft then taxied out, the temperature of the top of the wing was about minus 5 degrees centigrade, with an outside air temperature of plus 1, meaning that the first snowflakes that came in contact with the wing skin immediately froze. And the next layer of snowflakes then melted and refroze, forming a rough, uneven layer of ice crystals under a top layer of harmless-looking fluffy snowflakes. And during the takeoff, the airflow over the wing stripped away this top layer of snow, leaving behind that rough, frozen, irregular ice surface, which was thoroughly stuck to the wing, and that would now severely impact the wing's ability to create lift. Now, we know that this captain knew the importance of de-icing a jet's wings when icing was suspected to be there, otherwise he wouldn't have de-iced the aircraft in Winnipeg before that first flight of the day. But when he saw those big fluffy snowflakes melting in Dryden, his mental modus operandi was that of a pilot with 24,000 hours of experience almost exclusively on propeller aircraft. Cold-soaked fuel was a phenomenon associated with jets and their high cruising altitudes, in which he and his co-pilot had only minimal experience. And because of the operational pressure that he was now under, his mind was likely preoccupied with other things and therefore had reverted back to his previous experience instead of recalling only recently acquired theoretical knowledge. Which finally meant that his motivation to get Flight 1363 going, instead of having it cancelled in Dryden, was just too strong. A classic example of get-there-itis. Now, what should have protected him and his co-pilot from themselves were a framework of rules and winter ops procedures, as well as an organization supporting its pilots instead of expecting them to find ways around these rules. But that didn't exist. This is actually a fundamental truth in aviation and a bitter lesson learned from a long list of accidents. Procedures are in place to protect us pilots from ourselves when our judgment cannot be fully trusted. And that brings us to the sad end of this story. After a takeoff roll that was approximately 120 meters longer than normal, the aircraft rotated with about 750 meters of runway remaining, but it then just shuddered on the verge of a stall and settled back down. The second liftoff occurred about 100 meters before the end of the 1,828 meter long runway, but again, instead of climbing, the aircraft just remained in level flight with a nose-high altitude, flying past the end of the runway and on towards the descending terrain beyond. Witnesses saw the aircraft dipping, first the right wing and then the left, eventually striking trees in the distance, and after contacting the first treetops, the aircraft then continued for another 500 meters before it struck even more treetops, leaving a trail of wreckage behind. A fire now broke out on the left side of the aircraft as it descended, and it was actually that side of the aircraft that struck the ground first before the rest of the wreckage also impacted and came to a grinding halt. The post-crash fire then burned for a full 2 hours, which meant that it destroyed the Mylar recording tapes inside both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, leaving no recordings at all to aid in the investigation. And more importantly, out of the 69 people on board, 24 people perished, including Captain Morwood, First Officer Mills and Catherine Say, one of the 2 flight attendants. The aircraft's behavior during takeoff was a textbook example of a jet taking off with contaminated wings. And during the Fokker 28's ground school, the pilots had been instructed about the sensitivity of its wings to ice and snow contamination. But what took place on that winter day in Ontario was a perfect example of a balancing act between protection and production, or safety and revenue. Air Ontario's Fokker 28 operation was designed from the start on an impossibly slack tightrope, and by putting 2 totally inexperienced pilots in an aircraft with an inoperative APU on a challenging winter rotation with almost non-existent ground support, it had finally made that tightrope almost impossible to cross. So when Captain Morwood lost his decision-making balance in Dryden, there was no procedural safety net left to catch him. This meant that even though that ultimate decision to depart was taken by this crew, what actually caused this accident was a systemic fault. A fault from a system that consisted not only of Air Ontario and its questionable habits, but also by Air Canada, which with its experience and know-how could have helped its junior partner evolve into a safe organization, but hadn't. Another part of the problem was found to be Transport Canada, the regulating authority that had drawn out the process of approval of the MEL through bureaucratic obstacles, and had then been much too lax in all aspects of its supervision of Air Ontario. It had approved Air Ontario's operating certificate amendment to include the Fokker 28 in June of 1988, without even ensuring that an approved operator MEL existed, and had then continued to allow the aircraft to operate in commercial service for over 9 months without it. Those examples are just a small part of what was uncovered in great detail in the Mushansky report, which we will link to here below. And when it was released 3 years after the accident, it forever changed the perspective of accident investigation, and not only in aviation. No longer was individual failures the focus. Instead, the Mushansky report recognized that a combination of an incompetent organization and an unsafe culture could overwhelm an individual's ability to make sound judgment. And that's probably one of the most important lessons that could be drawn from this whole accident. Finally, there is also a bitter footnote to this accident. On March 22, 1992, only a few days before the Moshansky report was due to be released, US Air Flight 405, another Fokker 28, crashed after takeoff at New York's LaGuardia Airport with 27 fatalities. And although that aircraft had been de-iced, snow and ice had then accumulated again on its wings during an extremely long taxi-out time. And when Judge Moshansky heard of this, he reportedly said, "My God, it's Dryden all over again." Tragically, the second interim report on the Dryden crash, which had been published in December of 1990, over 2 years before Flight 405 crashed, contained several recommendations regarding de-icing facility locations and the use of different types of de- and anti-icing fluid types. And had those recommendations been followed, well, then it's very possible that the US Air accident could have been avoided. But due to an organizational failure, that report had only been sent to the Prime Minister's office and never to the American Federal Aviation Administration. Now, I know that this was a bit of a different video since it wasn't created based on a traditional final report, but our new scriptwriter Robert has done a fantastic job in plowing through the enormous Moshansky report to get this script created. We now employ over 15 people full-time on the various Mentour channels, and that's only possible thanks to our sponsors and the fantastic support of our people in our Patreon crew. Now, if you want to take part in that and get a preview and help improve our videos before anyone else gets to see them, well then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. You can try it out completely for free and all support is hugely appreciated. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.